Section 1. Yellow skin. The color. Nobody questions. Let's start with the most obvious thing in the entire show. The thing sitting in front of you every single time you've ever watched The Simpsons, across however many years you've been watching it. Sitting right there in plain view across every season and every episode and every piece of merchandise you've ever glanced at. The Simpson family is yellow. Not metaphorically, not symbolically, literally, unmistakably bright, warm yellow. Homer's face is yellow. Marge's face is yellow. Bart and Lisa and Maggie and their neighbors and co-workers in the congregation at the First Church of Springfield, and the staff at Moe's Tavern and the guards at Springfield Penitentiary, all of them yellow. An entire town of yellow people going about their yellow lives in perfect ordinary contentment, and none of them ever commenting on it, because in Springfield, the yellow is simply existence. It's not a feature. It's just how things are. And right here, before we get into any stranger territory, we've already stumbled into the first Mandela effect. Because if you ask most people, people who grew up watching the show, people who have seen 300 episodes, people who quote Simpsons dialogue in casual conversation the way others quote song lyrics, if you ask them to close their eyes and describe the exact shade of the family's skin, they will almost unanimously describe the same color. Crayon yellow. Primary yellow. Bright, flat, saturated yellow, the kind you'd find in a box of 8 crayons right next to the red and the blue. Simple, uncomplicated yellow, the kind a child reaches for when drawing the sun. That's what people describe. But that is not what is on screen. Pull up almost any episode of The Simpsons and look carefully. Not the way you watch the show while eating dinner or folding laundry. Look at it the way you'd look at a painting you were trying to understand. What you'll see is not crayon yellow. What you'll see is something warmer and more complex than that. It's golden. It has an orange undertone. It sits in the part of the color wheel that's closer to amber than to the yellow of school buses or cautionary road signs. It's the yellow of late afternoon sunlight coming through a west-facing window, or the color of a pale wildflower in the last weeks of summer. Beautiful in its warmth, and slightly different from what most people carry in their memory of it. The specific hex value that animators have documented for the Simpson family skin over the years sits most commonly around F5C518, which, if you look at a swatch of it directly and compare it to a pure primary yellow, is noticeably warmer, noticeably more golden, noticeably more complex than the crayon the mind reaches for. The two colors are close enough that the difference might seem trivial, and yet the difference is there, and the direction of the error is consistent. Almost everyone misremembers the yellow as more primary, more flat, more like a simple cartoon color than it actually is. Most viewers, when confronted with this, do a genuine double take. The shade they remember and the shade on screen are recognizably related, close enough to be clearly the same color family, but not quite the same. Here is why that happens. Matt Groening, when he designed the show in the late 1980s, gave his characters yellow skin for a specific and practical reason. He wanted The Simpsons to be instantly recognizable. When someone was flipping through channels, and in 1989 this was how you watched television, you moved between options rather than selecting them in advance. He wanted anyone who landed on The Simpsons for even a fraction of a second to know immediately what they were looking at. The yellow skin was a brand mark. Before anyone called it a brand mark, no other show had yellow people. No other show would have yellow people. The yellow was the show. And it worked completely and permanently. You know the yellow. The yellow announced the show the moment you turned to the right channel, before the title card appeared, before any dialogue, before you could have known what episode it was. Just the sight of a yellow face and you were already there, already in Springfield, already home. The brain, having absorbed this visual information successfully, yes, yellow Simpsons got it, filed away the general category rather than the specific value. It stored yellow with a capital I we. the meaning of the color rather than the precise wavelength. And when that stored memory is later accessed and reconstructed, the brain reaches for what yellow most centrally means in its stored vocabulary, which is indeed something closer to crayon yellow, to primary yellow, to the simplest and most archetypal form of the color. The warmth, the amber undertone, the specific golden quality, these were real, and they were watched thousands of times, but they were never what the brain was looking for when it looked at the screen. The brain was looking for the signal that said Simpsons, and the yellow provided that signal, and the precise details of that yellow became unnecessary information. And then there's the complication of consistency across seasons. The show's early seasons were produced using traditional ink and paint animation processes, and the color calibration of those episodes has a slightly different character than later seasons. Early seasons often have a cooler, more saturated quality to the skin tones, while later seasons, particularly after the move to digital coloring and HD production, show a somewhat warmer and more golden version of the same skin. The HD remaster versions of older episodes, which is how many younger viewers have encountered the show's early seasons, apply color correction that can further alter the apparent shade. An episode that aired in 1993 on a standard definition, television in a living room with incandescent lighting, looked different from the same episode watched in 2020 on a streaming service on a high-resolution screen with LED backlighting. Viewers who grew up with the early seasons on standard definition televisions have a genuinely different visual record to work from than viewers who encountered the show entirely through streaming and Blu-ray releases. Both groups remember the same yellow, Simpsons yellow, that's the one, but the specific yellow they're reconstructing is sourced from different technical contexts, and those contexts produce subtly different results. Now here's the second layer of this Mandela effect, which is stranger and more interesting than the color question alone. Think about every time a celebrity or guest character appeared on The Simpsons. These characters, the visitors, and the guests, and the one-time figures from the real world who stepped into Springfield's universe were drawn differently from the regular residents. Their proportions were more natural. Their eyes were more conventionally shaped. Their features corresponded more closely to what actual human faces look like. They had 5 fingers on each hand, where the Simpsons family had 4. This was deliberate. Outsiders looked more real. Locals looked more distorted. The distinction was clear and intentional, and it communicated something about who belonged in Springfield and who was visiting. But a significant number of viewers, when discussing episodes that featured famous guest appearances, remember the guests as having yellow skin. They remember the visual consistency being greater than it was. They remember the show as more stylistically unified than it actually was. This happens because the story of the episode, what the guests did and what scenes they were in, is what the brain retained and organized the memory around. The visual distinction between 5 fingers and 4, between naturalistic proportions and the specific Simpsons distortion. These details were peripheral to the meaning of what happened in the episode, and peripheral details fade in favor of the central narrative. The yellow got universalized in memory. The thing that was in fact specific to Springfield residents became in memory something that extended to everyone on screen, because the show was so strongly associated with that look that the exceptions didn't survive the compression. The yellow of The Simpsons is simultaneously the most obvious and most invisible thing about the show. You see it instantly, you identify the show by it, and then it disappears from conscious attention for the entire episode, processed as the background condition of the world you're watching. A background condition stored as an impression rather than a fact, which is why right now the specific shade of that yellow might be one of the things you're least sure about. You've been looking at it your entire life. You've never quite looked at it. It is worth spending a moment longer on the yellow because it opens up a question that will follow us through the rest of the night, through every section we explore. The question is this: what is the difference between knowing a thing and noticing it? You know the Simpsons are yellow. You have always known it. You could not have failed to know it. The yellow is the first and most immediate visual fact of the show, visible at a glance from across a room on someone else's screen. The knowing was easy. It required nothing from you. The yellow arrived in your mind effortlessly and installed itself as permanent, reliable knowledge. But noticing is something different. Noticing the yellow would have required deliberately directing attention at it, pausing the flow of the show to examine a specific detail that the show was not asking you to examine. It would have required treating it as a question rather than an answer, looking at the yellow the way you might look at a color swatch you were considering for a wall. Deliberately, analytically, with real attention to the specific qualities of the hue. Almost no one watches The Simpsons that way, at least not on a first or casual viewing. Almost no one watches television that way. We are drawn into the narrative, the characters, the jokes, the emotional progression of the scene. The background details are processed just enough to maintain the coherent world, and then they're set aside while attention moves to the things the show is asking us to attend to. The yellow, like the couch color, like the exact number of Homer's stubble dots, like the specific shade of Ned's sweater. All of these are background details, processed but not examined, known in the sense that they don't surprise us, but not stored in the precise and retrievable form that noticing would have produced. And then, years later, someone asks, what color was the couch? What shade of yellow were they? How many sprinkles? And we reach for the precision we never collected, and we find instead the impression, warm, familiar, complete in its emotional accuracy, imprecise in its specifics. This is the gentle paradox at the heart of every Mandela effect we'll explore tonight. The things we remember most vividly are the things that mattered most to us. And the things that mattered most, we were too busy experiencing to carefully record. Drop a comment letting us know where you're watching from and what time it is where you are. And if you want more of these late-night breakdowns, subscribing is the only thing I'll ever ask you to do. Now let's keep going. Slowly. Section 2. Homer's Donut, the missing sprinkle. There is a single prop from the world of The Simpsons that has become more iconic than almost anything from the show's actual episodes. Not the nuclear power plant, not the saxophone, not the couch, not the television in the living room. A donut. Homer's donut. The pink frosted donut that floats through the title sequence, that Homer chases or nearly catches or fumbles with, depending on which version of the opening you're watching. The donut that has appeared on more pieces of Simpsons merchandise than it's probably possible to track, that has become so associated with Homer's appetites and character that it has taken on a life completely independent of any specific scene or episode. Mention a pink frosted donut to someone who knows anything about American animation, and Homer Simpson will be the first thing they think of. And almost nobody remembers the donut correctly. The errors in memory around the donut are layered in a way that makes the whole thing particularly interesting to sit with. There isn't one wrong detail. There are several, and they reinforce each other and build toward a composite memory of the donut that is recognizable and closely related to the actual prop, but that diverges from it in ways that reveal something genuine about how the mind handles beloved objects. The first and most common discrepancy involves the sprinkles. Ask someone who loves The Simpsons to describe Homer's donut, and they will, with great confidence, describe a donut that is generously sprinkled. They will describe chocolate sprinkles distributed across most of the visible surface of the pink frosting. A well-decorated donut. A donut that received the full attention of whoever was responsible for putting sprinkles on it. Not an overloaded donut, but a donut that has been given its due. One where the coverage is thorough and satisfying, and does proper justice to the frosting underneath. The actual donut that appears in the opening credits is notably sparser than this, depending on which version of the opening sequence you're watching, and there are multiple versions, which we'll get to in a moment. The donut typically carries only a small number of sprinkles. The frosting is largely clean and open. The sprinkles are scattered rather than distributed. They appear in clusters or isolated marks rather than in even coverage. It's a simple donut, an economically decorated donut. The kind of donut drawn by an animator who had a deadline and who knew the object's role in the sequence was to be caught and then dropped, and that the specific sprinkle count was not going to be anyone's primary concern. And yet the memory supplies more. The memory sees the donut as fuller, richer, more abundantly decorated than the animation depicts. There is a clear psychological reason for this. Homer Simpson is the character who exists most completely in a state of pure appetite. His relationship to food, the yearning, the ecstasy, the physical helplessness in the face of something he wants to eat, is one of the most thoroughly developed comic characterizations in the history of the medium. The sound he makes when imagining or anticipating food has become one of the most widely imitated pieces of vocal performance in American entertainment, replicated across cultures and languages and by people who may not even know much else about the show. That sound communicates an entire philosophy. Some things are worth wanting completely, and a truly good donut is among them. That characterization shapes the memory of the object. The donut Homer wants so completely, the donut he chases and reaches for with an urgency that suggests nothing else in the world exists, while that donut is within reach. That donut deserves to look like a donut worth pursuing with that kind of urgency. Memory, faithful to the character rather than to the specific animation cells, dressed the donut up accordingly. It gave the donut more sprinkles. It made the frosting look fresher. It made the pink look more saturated and appetizing. It upgraded the prop to match the desire. The second layer of the donut misremembering involves the quality of the frosting itself, independent of the sprinkles. A number of viewers, when they describe the donut from memory, will include some reference to how the frosting looks. They'll describe it as looking fresh. They'll use words like glossy or shiny. They'll describe a frosting that looks like it was applied recently and hasn't had time to dry into that slightly matte, slightly firm texture that frosting develops as it settles. This is not what the animation depicts. The animation shows a flat, cartoon-style frosting. It doesn't render with any realistic wet surface quality, because that isn't how this show's animation style typically approaches food. And it would have been inconsistent with the general aesthetic to make one donut prop look photorealistic in an environment that otherwise operates on cartoon visual logic. The gleam that people remember is a projection. The brain watched Homer's emotional relationship to the donut and used it to upgrade the visual representation in memory. Homer's donut is worth wanting, therefore the donut looks like something worth wanting. The pixels showed a flat pink circle with a few chocolate marks. The memory stores a donut that almost smells like something. This is actually a well-documented phenomenon in how memory handles food. Food memory is among the most emotionally potent and contextually saturated forms of memory that humans possess. The brain stores food memories not just as images, but as complete sensory and emotional experiences. The taste, the smell, the hunger, or fullness of the person at the moment of viewing. All of these enter the memory alongside whatever visual information was present, and they modified the visual record. For Homer's donut, this means that viewers who watch the show while eating, and a substantial number of people watch The Simpsons while eating food, particularly children watching on weekend mornings or weekday evenings at dinner time, brought their own sensory context into the experience of the donut. The donut on screen absorbed some of the experience of eating while watching. It became, in memory, a food object with real sensory qualities. The third and most structurally complex layer of the donut Mandela effect involves the opening credits themselves. Because the opening is not a single fixed thing. It is a family of related sequences that have changed across the show's run in more ways than most viewers fully track. The Simpsons opening has been revised multiple times. The most famous revision, after the show moved to high definition production, produced what fans call the HD opening, which was longer and more detailed than the classic version. But there were also earlier versions and special editions and episode specific variations, all of which create a situation where viewers who watched across different periods of the show's run have different source material labeled under the same heading. Simpsons opening donut. The donut in the HD opening is not identical in composition to the donut in the classic opening. The animation is more detailed, the color slightly different in quality. The spatial relationship between Homer and the donut changed by the revised framing. Someone who formed their primary memory of the opening from the classic version and someone who formed it from the HD version have technically been watching different donuts. When they compare memories, the differences that emerge might be attributed to misremembering when they're actually the result of watching genuinely different source material. None of this knowledge changes the donut in memory. Right now, wherever you are, the donut that exists in your head as Homer's donut is the right donut. It has the right number of sprinkles for the version of Homer you fell in love with. The frosting has the right sheen. The pink is the right pink. And it's probably not quite what's on screen. And that's okay. The memory donut is the donut you needed it to be. The screen donut was the donut they had time to draw. Both of them are Homer's donut. Neither of them is wrong. Let's stay with the donut a little longer because there are a few more layers worth exploring before we move on. And donuts are the kind of subject where more layers are always welcome. One of the things that makes the donut memory particularly interesting is the way it intersects with the donut as a prop in specific episodes versus the donut as a recurring background element. The show's most memorable donut moments, the episodes built around Homer's relationship with donuts as a subject of comedy or pathos, tend to feature donuts that were drawn with specific attention. These featured donuts got more care from the animators. The colors were more deliberate, the shape more precisely rendered, the relationship between Homer and the specific donut more visually considered. These featured episode donuts tend to be what people actually remember when they think of the Homer donut, even though Homer interacts with background donuts in far more scenes. The memorable donut is not the average donut. It is the donut from the moment that stood out, the donut from the scene that went somewhere surprising or emotionally resonant or particularly funny. This is consistent with how food memory generally works. We don't remember the average meal at a restaurant. We remember the best one or the worst one, or the one that coincided with a significant moment in our lives. We don't remember the typical version of our favorite food. We remember the first time we had it, or the best version, or the one someone we loved made for us in a kitchen that no longer exists. The exceptional instances colonize the category. The Homer donut in memory is the exceptional donut, drawn with care for a scene that mattered, generalized into the universal donut that Homer supposedly always has. And because the exceptional version was drawn with more precision and more color than the typical one, it tends to be more vivid and more detailed in memory than the average of all the donuts Homer has touched would warrant. There is something genuinely sweet about this, in both senses of the word. The exceptional donut, the one from the scene that made you laugh or made you feel something, became the representative donut because it was the one that earned its place in memory. It carried emotional weight. It was attached to a moment that mattered. And so memory filed it under Homer's donut as the exemplar of the category, which is a reasonable and efficient thing to do. The specific color of the frosting, the specific number of sprinkles, these details belong to that one exceptional donut, drawn with care for one exceptional scene. And they became the universal details, the details that now feel canonical, that feel like facts about the show rather than facts about one specific moment. This is how a lot of things become canonical in memory, not through repetition, not through being the average, but through being attached to something that mattered. The detail that was present during a moment of genuine feeling gets promoted to universal status, regardless of whether it was actually consistent across the full body of material. The donut memory is a love letter. It's the record of a specific moment when a cartoon donut made something feel true. And memory kept it, with all its specific details, because those details were present when something real was happening. That's a strange and lovely thing. Section 3. The Couch. How many versions did you actually see? Every episode of The Simpsons contains the same fundamental image, and it appears twice. Once at the beginning, as the family races home through the town to complete the ritual of arrival, and once at the end, as the closing image before the credits roll, the image that says the story is complete, the family is assembled. Everything that went wrong today has been set aside for now. The couch. The family on it. The television across the room. The four walls of the living room on Evergreen Terrace containing the 5 people who make up the Simpson household, sitting together in the specific, casual proximity of people who have sat in this exact arrangement so many times that the arrangement has stopped being a choice and become a fact of their shared existence. The couch gag, which is one of the most inventive recurring elements in television history, has used this moment of arrival as a laboratory for 36 years of creative experimentation. Every episode, the family arrives at the couch and something different happens. Sometimes it's a single image that departs slightly from expectation and then resolves. Sometimes it's an extended sequence that represents some of the most ambitious animation the show has ever produced. Sometimes it's a guest sequence from an outside artist whose visual language is completely different from the show's own. But here's the couch Mandela effect, and it is one of the most consistent and most widely shared misrememberings in the entire Simpsons universe. The couch is blue. Most people remember it as orange. Not slightly orange, not orangish, but a specific warm orange that feels entirely appropriate for the Simpson household. A faded orange, the kind that suggests a couch bought sometime in the mid to late 70s or early 80s, when that particular shade of upholstery was completely normal for a working-class American living room. An honest, unpretentious orange that matches the family's economic position and their general approach to interior decoration, which can be described as functional rather than aspirational. That couch in that orange lives in the memory of a genuinely remarkable number of people who have watched the show for decades. People who have seen this couch in thousands of scenes. People who watch the family sit on it hundreds of times. And yet the couch they remember is orange and the couch on screen is blue. The blue is not subtle. In most scenes, in most lighting conditions, the couch reads clearly and unmistakably as blue. A medium blue somewhere between a formal navy and a casual cornflower. It's a perfectly plausible couch for the Simpson household. It just doesn't match what most people remember. There are a few distinct pathways to this misremembering, and they're worth tracing because each reveals something different about how the brain handles visual background details. The most straightforward pathway involves the overall color temperature of the Simpson living room. The walls are a warm gray beige. The carpet is a medium brownish green that trends warm. The TV set in earlier episodes has a warm plastic beige casing. Homer himself, when seated on the couch, is golden yellow. The room as an overall environment trends warm, and the couch, despite being a blue object, sits inside this warm environment and gets partially absorbed by it in memory. When the brain processes a scene involving the living room, it takes in the whole picture. The family, the action, the dialogue, the lighting. The couch is there, but the couch is furniture, and furniture is by definition the least interesting part of the scene. The couch gets stored as a general impression of the living room, and the general impression of the living room trends warm because the warm elements dominate the scene's emotional temperature. The couch ends up tagged as warm in memory, and when that tag is retrieved and given a color, the most available warm furniture color that fits the period and social context of the Simpson household is orange. The second pathway is more specific. There is a piece of furniture in the Simpson living room that is warmer in tone than the couch. The armchair, which sits near the couch and shares the frame with it in many living room scenes, has a warmer color profile. Over hundreds of viewings, the warmth of the armchair migrated into the memory of the couch because both objects were tagged under the same category, living room seating, and the warmth that was accurate for one transferred to the other. The third pathway involves what the couch represents rather than what it looks like. The Simpson family's couch is a character in the show in a way that most pieces of furniture never achieve. The couch gag has given it a kind of narrative personality, and the couch as an emotional symbol, warmth, belonging, family, home, the specific feeling of falling onto a couch after a long day, has warm color associations in the emotional vocabulary of the culture. Orange is cozy. Orange is domestic. Orange is the color of a fire in a fireplace, of a lamp in a living room, of a home in autumn. Blue is cooler. Blue is memory, faithful to the meaning rather than the color, stored the couch as a warm thing. The warmth found its way into the color. The orange appeared. Now let's talk about the couch gag itself as a source of Mandela effects, because the gag's very creativity generates its own specific set of memory problems. The couch gag has been running for 36 years. In that time, it has produced somewhere in the range of 500 distinct sequences, 500 individual creative gestures, each attached to the same spatial setup, each designed to be surprising. 500 individual memories stored under a single label. When you remember a couch gag, even a specific one that stands out, you are accessing a memory that was filed alongside 499 others. The details of any specific gag blur with the details of others that were stored nearby. Memorable elements from different gags merge into composite memories that feel like they refer to a single specific episode, but that actually contain elements from two or three. The most commonly discussed example involves people who remember a specific couch gag where the family is depicted in a completely different animation style and arrives at the couch to find it belongs to a different fictional world. This type of gag definitely exists. The show has done multiple versions of the animation style switch couch gag, but the specific details people remember, which episode it was, which style was being referenced, what happened when the family arrived, often don't match any single entry in the canon. The memory is assembled from two or three different gags compressed into a single confident memory of a specific episode the person is certain they saw, but that may not exist exactly as they remember it. You watched 500 couch gags and your brain gave you a single vivid memory. That's not failure. That's compression. Your brain managed 500 items with one storage slot and kept just enough detail to make the memory feel real. The couch is blue. The memory said orange. And the family is always on it, which is the only part that was ever required to be exactly right. There is a dimension of the couch gag, misremembering, that goes beyond simple visual confusion, though, and that has to do with the emotional weight the couch gag carries within the structure of the show. The opening sequence of The Simpsons is not just a titles card, it is a ritual. For the dedicated viewer, watching the opening sequence is an act of arrival. You are settling in. You are orienting yourself within a known world. You are preparing to spend the next 22 minutes in Springfield. The couch gag is the final beat of that arrival. It is the moment where you land. And because it is a moment of arrival, it is charged with a particular kind of feeling that is distinct from anything else in the episode. The couch gag happens before the story begins. It exists in the liminal space between the outside world and Springfield. And events in liminal spaces are notoriously difficult to remember precisely. Because liminal experiences are processed differently from narrative ones. You were not yet fully inside the show when the couch gag was happening. You were in the threshold. And threshold moments, however vivid they feel in the moment, leave impressionistic rather than detailed traces. Consider how you remember walking into a party or arriving at a place you hadn't visited in years, or the first few seconds of waking up somewhere unfamiliar. These arrival moments often feel significant and highly charged, and yet when you try to recall specific details from them, the exact configuration of the room, the precise words that were first said to you, the exact thought you had, they are often harder to pin down than the events that followed once you were fully present. The couch gag lives in that psychological space. You were arriving every time. You were never quite fully there. This might also explain one of the stranger couch gag memory phenomena. The viewers who are absolutely certain they remember a couch gag that absolutely no one else remembers. Not a gag that's close to something real, and not a gag that can be explained by conflation with another. A gag that seems to exist in one person's memory in vivid, specific, unrepeatable detail, with no analog anywhere in the archival record. The most sympathetic explanation for this, and I think it's the correct one, is that some of these memories are not memories of the show at all. They are memories of something the mind generated during the arrival threshold. A couch gag that your dreaming, arriving mind briefly assembled from available parts before the real one began. A couch gag you almost watched before you were fully awake to it. The mind, arriving at something it knows and loves, sometimes gets there early and starts the story without the screen's help. And the story it tells can be mistaken later for the one that was actually shown. The couch in these cases is not just furniture, it is a canvas. Your memory painted it. Section 4. Marge's hair, blue or black or something else entirely. There is a visual element of The Simpsons that is simultaneously the most distinctive and the most misremembered thing about the show's primary family. It rises from Marge Simpson's head in a dense, vertical column of curls, ascending to a point several feet above the crown of her skull, maintaining its shape across 36 years and nearly 800 episodes, with a structural integrity that puts most actual architecture to shame. Marge's hair is one of the most recognizable things in American entertainment. It communicates her identity from across a room, at any resolution, from any angle. You see the tower and you know who it belongs to before you've registered her face or her voice. The hair is the identity in a way that goes beyond anything a hairstyle should reasonably be expected to accomplish. And the color of that hair is the center of one of the most widely shared and most internally varied Mandela effects in the entire Simpsons canon. Everyone agrees it's blue. That much is universal. Marge Simpson has blue hair. This is as settled as the yellow skin, as settled as Homer's job at the nuclear plant. Blue hair, that's Marge. Here is where the settlement ends. The specific shade of that blue is remembered differently by different people in ways that create collectively a spectrum of different colors rather than a consensus on a single one. If you gathered 100 people who love The Simpsons and asked each of them to select the precise shade of Marge's hair from a color swatch, you would end up with answers ranging from deep navy to pale cornflower to something approaching dark blue-black. And every single person would be confident in their answer. And no two answers would be exactly the same. Some people remember a rich, dark navy, the blue of formal occasions, of the deep end of the ocean, of a night sky in a clear winter city. A confident, saturated blue that reads as a strong color choice. Some people remember a medium, uncomplicated blue. The kind that sits at the center of what blue means, the blue of a clear sky on a day without much weather. Some people remember something lighter and softer, the blue of faded denim, a color that has given up some of its intensity and become gentler. And some people, A consistent minority, but a real and distinct group. Remember the hair as being so dark that it might not be blue at all in some lights. A deep blue-black, the kind that reveals its blue quality only when the angle is exactly right. All of these memories are plausibly traceable to the actual show. The blue of Marge's hair has not been perfectly consistent across 36 years of production. The show moved through different production contexts: traditional ink and paint, digital coloring, and eventually HD production, and each produced color calibrations slightly different from each other. The blue that was mixed for early seasons was not identical to the blue calibrated for HD production. Add to this the fact that color appears differently depending on lighting conditions within scenes. Marge in outdoor daylight shows a different shade than Marge in fluorescent institutional lighting, than Marge in the warm interior light of the family living room. Her hair absorbs and reflects the ambient light of each scene and reads differently as a result. And all of this is happening against the color rendering of whatever device the viewer was using. Older televisions were notoriously inconsistent in their color reproduction, and the same frame of animation could look substantially different on two different sets in two different households. The generation that watched the show in the early 90s on whatever television was in the family living room received a different calibration of Marge's blue than viewers who watched entirely on modern high-quality screens. But the variation runs deeper than just technical conditions. Marge's hair as a visual symbol communicates character, and different viewers have related to that expressive quality differently, and their relationship to what the hair means has influenced how they remember what the hair looks like. Viewers who see Marge primarily as a figure of stability and resilience, the emotional anchor of the family, the one who holds things together while everything tries to fall apart, tend to remember her hair as a darker, more structural blue, a color that reads as solid and trustworthy. Deep navy, something that endures. Viewers who see Marge primarily as an individual with her own desires and frustrations, someone who gave up certain things to become the person the family needed her to be, these viewers tend to remember the hair as having a softer, more bittersweet quality. Not a declarative blue, but a searching one. Neither of these is the official answer. They're readings of the character translated into color preferences, and those preferences shape the specific memory of what the color actually was. There's also the question of what happens when Marge's hair comes down. On a small number of occasions across the show's run, episodes have depicted Marge with her hair undone. The tower released, revealing the enormous length of hair apparently compressed and coiled inside it all along. These episodes are memorable precisely because they're so unexpected. Marge with her hair down looks almost like a different character, and viewers who remember these scenes are frequently uncertain about the color of the hair when it's down. Some remember it as the same blue as the tower. Some remember it as dark brown, as though the blue might be a dye that doesn't extend to the full natural length. Some simply don't know. They remember the scene. They remember being surprised by it, but the specific visual detail of what color that fallen hair was has not survived in their memory with any precision. The tower is what the brain filed under Marge hair. The tower is the identity marker. The fallen hair is an exception, something outside the regular filing system, stored as a narrative event rather than as a visual fact with a specific color attached. Marge's hair is blue. The specific blue is yours as much as it is the show's. The tower is more consistent than anything in the real world. 36 years of it never moving, never faltering, never shrinking or changing its fundamental shape. And the blue, whatever specific blue your memory chose to store, has been marking the top of that tower since before most of the people listening to this were born. Section 5. Ned Flanders and the Mustache. Question picture. Ned Flanders. Take a moment. Let the image assemble. The green sweater. The wire-rimmed glasses. The expression of a man who has decided at some point in his history that goodwill is the only reasonable response to existence, and who has been executing that decision ever since with remarkable consistency, despite the evidence against its practicality. Now answer honestly. Does he have a mustache? The answer feels obvious. Of course, Ned has a mustache. Ned's mustache is part of Ned. It's small, it's neat, it's the specific kind of slightly dense upper lip mustache that reads as earnest and decent. The mustache of a man who takes his commitments seriously without taking himself too seriously. It's a very Ned mustache. It belongs to him completely. Here is the first Mandela effect hiding inside this image. The mustache disappears in specific episodes, and a consistent group of viewers either didn't notice this at the time or have subsequently restored the mustache in their memory of those episodes, because their internal model of Ned includes the mustache as a fixed feature. This isn't a matter of the show permanently removing the mustache. Ned's mustache is present in the vast majority of his appearances, but animation across hundreds of episodes by different artists and different production teams produces inconsistencies, and the mustache is one of the character features most subject to variation. In some scenes, it's clearly rendered. In others, it's lighter, less defined, present in outline but not fully drawn in. In a small number of scenes across the show's long run, it's been omitted entirely, whether by oversight or by deliberate choice for a specific story reason. Viewers watching those scenes in real time mostly didn't notice. The mind, running its existing model of Ned and cross-referencing it against the image on screen, made a subconscious adjustment. The mustache is supposed to be there. The scene is consistent with the model. Let's keep watching. The absence didn't register as noteworthy because the mind was filling in the expected detail rather than carefully auditing the screen. And in memory, the restoration is complete. Those scenes are recalled with the mustache present. The model wins over the record. The inverse version of this effect also exists. Some viewers, those who watched the show during its earliest seasons, and formed their first impression of Ned before the character fully consolidated into the iconic version most people know, remember him as less mustachioed. Not clean-shaven exactly, but less defined in the facial hair department, as though the mustache was still finding its way in those early episodes. This memory also corresponds to something real. Early animation of the show's characters was inconsistent, and the specific rendering of Ned's mustache in early episodes differs from the more settled version that appears in the show's middle and later run. Both memories feel right. Both feel like genuine records of a genuine Ned. The show contains variations that both memories could reasonably have been sourced from. Now let's go deeper into what the mustache represents in memory and why it's one of the specific details that people hold on to so firmly. The mustache is doing a lot of psychological work as a memory anchor for Ned's identity. It communicates something specific about the character that his name or his religion alone wouldn't communicate quite as efficiently. It says, "This man arrived at his identity a while ago. He made his choices. He knows who he is." The mustache is a choice that has been made and maintained. It represents a settled self in a neighborhood full of unsettled people. Homer, by contrast, is clean-shaven, and Homer is one of the least settled characters in the show, perpetually surprised by his own life, perpetually reacting to things he should have anticipated, perpetually in a state of impulsive forward motion without a clear destination. The absence of a mustache on Homer is the absence of that settledness. The presence of a mustache on Ned is its presence. Memory, processing these two characters as contrasts, made the mustache into a stronger identity marker for Ned than it might otherwise have been. The mustache is part of what makes Ned not Homer. It's a visual element that participates in the moral and emotional logic of the show's central contrast, and moral and emotional logic is exactly what memory is built to retain. So, when a scene depicts Ned without the mustache or with a less fully rendered mustache, the mind overrides the incomplete visual with the emotionally correct model. Ned has a mustache, The mustache is part of what Ned means. Therefore, the mustache is there. There's a related Mandela effect involving the specific shade of green of Ned's signature sweater, which generates the same kind of confident but variable responses that Marge's hair blue generates. Some people remember it as a bright, cheerful green. Some remember it as a slightly more muted olive-adjacent green. Some remember it as quite dark. The sweater has been rendered inconsistently enough across the show's run that there's a real basis for the variation in memory, but the variation also reflects the same kind of emotional color assignment that we saw with Marge. What green feels right for this character? Bright, cheerful green is the green of a man who genuinely means it when he says good morning and makes it sound like a complete sentence. Muted olive green is the green of a man working hard to maintain cheerfulness against the grain of his actual experience. The green people remember tells you something about how they read the character's relationship to his own optimism. Ned Flanders is one of the most carefully constructed characters in the show's history, and the care of the construction means that viewers developed strong interpretive models of him that then shape the memories of his specific visual appearance. The mustache is there. The green is the right green. The glasses are the right shape. The character is assembled correctly in memory. The record might disagree on a detail or two, but the Ned who lives in your memory is the Ned who made sense to you, which is ultimately more useful than a photographic record. Let's sit with one more layer of the Ned memory question because it leads somewhere interesting. Ned Flanders is, along with Mr. Burns and Sideshow Bob, one of the characters who escaped the show most completely into the broader culture. Internet meme culture adopted Ned enthusiastically, and the version of Ned that circulates online tends to be a fairly particular visual. The green sweater, the mustache, the slight forward lean of someone about to say something earnest in an awkward situation. That internet Ned has become, for a large number of people who are younger or who encountered the show less deeply, the primary visual reference point for the character. And internet Ned was drawn and redrawn and stylized by thousands of different hands, each making slightly different choices about the mustache's precise size and shape, each calibrating the green slightly differently, each adjusting the glasses based on their own imperfect memory of the original. The result is a kind of distributed character design process where the collective internet has, over 15 or so years, slowly drifted the visual representation of Ned Flanders in subtle ways. Not dramatically, not in ways that anyone would notice episode by episode, but in the aggregate, if you look at how Ned is typically represented in memes and fan art, and casual references today versus how he appeared in season 4 of the show, there are small but real differences. And for anyone whose first or most frequent exposure to Ned has been through that secondary cultural layer rather than through the original episodes, the secondary version is the baseline. The original, if encountered, might feel slightly off. A Ned who is almost right but whose mustache is a different shape from the one you knew. This creates a fascinating inversion. Usually the Mandela effect story is, I watched the original show and my memory gradually distorted it. In some cases with Ned, the story is, I absorbed the cultural representation of the character. And when I finally watched the original show, the original was the thing that surprised me. The map precedes the territory. The echo shapes the expectations that we then bring to the source. This is not an unusual phenomenon in an age where cultural representations of things often travel faster and further than the things themselves. Many people have strong, detailed, entirely accurate mental images of places they have never visited, films they have never watched, books they have never read, all built from secondary representations, descriptions, references, quotes, screenshots, and discussions that circulated independently of the primary source. What it means for memory and truth is complicated and genuinely interesting, and it is something we will return to in the final section of this evening's journey. For now, let Ned settle into your mind the way he always does. Slightly too cheerful, slightly too persistent, mustache exactly the right size for his purposes, sweater the shade of green that fits the mood of a man who is trying harder than he should have to. Section 6. Burns' catchphrase. Did he actually say what you think? He said, "There is a word extended across its syllables, spoken in a tone somewhere between aristocratic satisfaction and the quiet pleasure of a predator who has been patient and has been rewarded for that patience. That has become one of the most imitated pieces of dialogue in television history. When something goes exactly as Charles Montgomery Burns intended, when a scheme reaches its designed conclusion, when an underling produces precisely the result that was ordained, he brings his extraordinarily long, extraordinarily thin fingertips together in a particular steepled gesture, and he produces a sound. Excellent. The word is stretched. The syllables are given room to develop. The first syllable arrives with a slight rise, the second settles with the satisfaction of something placed on a shelf exactly where it belongs. There is no hurry in it. There has never been any hurry in Charles Montgomery Burns, because hurry implies that the outcome was uncertain, and Burns does not deal in uncertainty. This is one of the most recognizable single words in American animated television. People who have never watched an episode of The Simpsons know this word as a Simpsons reference. The gesture that accompanies it has been performed by hundreds of millions of people across countless cultures and offices and at dinner tables, and in moments of personal triumph that in no objective way resemble anything that would occur to Mr. Burns. And here is the Mandela effect hidden inside it. Burns says this word far less often than almost anyone believes he does. When people describe Mr. Burns's verbal habits, they describe a character for whom excellent is essentially the default response to positive developments. A character who produces the word and the gesture as a reflex, automatically, reliably, every time something goes right. They remember it as constant, as nearly universal, as the word that defined his emotional vocabulary. Burns is not that character. Burns is a remarkably varied speaker whose vocabulary of approval spans a genuinely wide range of expressions. He says splendid. He says wonderful. He says extraordinary and magnificent and superb. He expresses satisfaction with the full register of an extremely educated man who was apparently attending the best educational institutions in the English-speaking world at a time when those institutions required extensive engagement with classical literature, and whose vocabulary reflects that education. Burns does not repeat himself. Burns has never needed to settle for the same word twice when the language contains so many alternatives. Excellent appears in the show. It appears in the specific steepled fingers context. It is unmistakably associated with the character and would be recognized by anyone who knows the show, but it appears as one expression among many rather than as the exclusive or even dominant mode of approval that memory has made it. What happened is that excellent was the expression that escaped the show's borders and became culturally transmitted. It was the one that got quoted and imitated and turned into a reference point outside of any specific episode. It spread through the culture independently of the show, available to anyone who wanted to express the concept of satisfied scheming, and in spreading it became universal in a way that its actual frequency in the show never justified, and that cultural universality fed back into individual memory. Having heard excellent performed by thousands of people in thousands of contexts as a Simpsons reference, the word became even more thoroughly associated with Burns in memory, because the association was being reinforced not just by watching the show, but by participating in the culture around it. Every time someone said excellent with that particular inflection, it confirmed the memory that Burns says it constantly. The result is a character who, in memory, says one thing with great frequency, and a show that gave that character a much richer verbal landscape that largely didn't survive the process of cultural transmission. There's a second related Mandela effect involving Burns that is in some ways more striking because it touches on something more fundamental to the character's identity. Burns's inability to remember Homer Simpson's name is one of the show's long-running comedy engines. Homer has worked for Burns for decades. Burns cannot reliably remember who Homer is. When Homer appears in front of Burns with any kind of regularity, Burns often doesn't recognize him or refers to him incorrectly, or has to be reminded of his name, or produces some completely wrong name with total confidence. The joke is that the relationship between employer and employee that has defined Homer's adult life is entirely one-sided. Homer knows Burns deeply. Burns barely knows Homer exists. Most viewers remember this as a completely consistent feature of the character across all appearances. Burns never remembers Homer's name. That's the rule. It never changes. But Burns has, in fact, correctly and naturally referred to Homer by name in various episodes across the show's run. Storylines that required Burns to have a personal relationship with Homer, or simply episodes where the writers needed Burns to know who Homer was for the plot to function, produced scenes where Burns says Simpson or Homer without any indication of confusion. These moments exist. They're in the episodes, and they are almost universally not registered by viewers as contradictions to the established characterization. This is a sophisticated form of selective memory. The brain has a working model of the Burns-Homer relationship, and that model is stable and useful. When a scene departs from that model by having Burns correctly name Homer, the departure is processed as a special case rather than as evidence against the model. Burns knows Homer's name in this episode because the story required it. The model holds. The model survives because the model is load-bearing. The joke, the established dynamic, the fundamental asymmetry of who knows whom, these are stored with precision because they're required for comprehension of any individual scene within the relationship. The specific episodes where Burns departs from the dynamic are stored more loosely because they're departures rather than foundation. Burns says, "Excellent," and he never remembers Homer, and he was alive for the Spanish-American War. These are the things memory kept. The precise frequency of the word, and the specific episodes where the memory lapse was temporarily suspended. These are details the model absorbed and smoothed over. The character is correct in memory. The count is slightly off, and nobody watching the show ever needed the precise count. There is one more Burns memory phenomenon worth exploring before we move on, and that is the question of the gesture itself, the steepled fingers, and whether it is as ubiquitous in the actual show as it is in cultural memory. Many viewers are genuinely surprised when they revisit early Burns appearances to find the steepled fingers gesture appearing less frequently than they expected. The gesture is there. It is unambiguously a Burns gesture, established in the show's early seasons and returned to consistently across its run. But the version that lives in cultural memory, where every excellent is accompanied by the precise hands-together presentation, overstates the frequency. Burns says excellent without the gesture sometimes. He makes the gesture sometimes without the word. The two are associated in memory more tightly than they are in the actual footage. This is a version of a phenomenon sometimes called semantic compression. When two elements consistently appear together in meaningful combinations, memory begins to store them as a single unit rather than as two separate items. The word and the gesture become one thing, and once they are one thing, the memory of either element tends to automatically recall the other, regardless of whether they were actually paired in any given instance. This happens with all kinds of associated information: a smell and a place, a song and a person, a particular phrase and the character who says it. The association becomes so strong that it overwrites the original episodic record. You stop remembering the specific instances and start remembering the type. Burns with steepled fingers is a type. It is the type of moment where Burns has arrived at a plan and is pleased about it. And that type level memory, stored and retrieved efficiently, is more available to you than any specific episode level memory of whether the hands were steepled or at his sides in a particular scene. The efficiency of it is remarkable. Your brain distilled 35 years of a character into a handful of reliable, retrievable images, and it kept the ones that were most useful for understanding who the character was. The exact words in the exact order with the exact gesture in every individual episode. That level of precision was never required. What was required was to know Burns on sight, to understand his relationship to power and age and cruelty, and the particular pleasure he takes in his own villainy. Memory gave you exactly what you needed. You can walk into any Burns scene in the show's entire run and immediately understand what is happening, immediately feel the familiar register of the character, immediately know what to expect and when to anticipate the turn. That's not an accident. That's a very precise and effective piece of mental work, and the fact that it got a detail or two wrong is an extremely small price to pay. Excellent. Section 7. The Quick E-Mart. Every detail you misremember. The Quick E-Mart is the most important fictional convenience store in the history of American entertainment. This is not a controversial claim. It exists as a place, as a punchline, as a character study, as a social observation, as the setting for countless scenes across 36 years of storytelling, as the backdrop for one of the most discussed character arcs in the show's history, and as a business that has been visited enough times in enough seasons that it has become as familiar as any real place most viewers have actually been. And it is remembered incorrectly in almost every specific visual detail. This is not surprising exactly. The Quickie Mart is a background location. It's the kind of place the show visits constantly but never examines closely. It's the setting for scenes that are about other things, about Homer's hunger or Bart's mischief or the social dynamics of Springfield's working class commerce. And the setting itself is almost never what the scene is about. You've been to the Quickie Mart hundreds of times across your relationship with the show. You've never once been studying it. The sign above the Quickie Mart is perhaps the most commonly misremembered specific visual element of the location. If you ask someone to describe it, they'll give you a confident answer that covers the basics. The name, the general color palette, the fact that it looks like a convenience store sign. But the specific details of their description will often be subtly wrong in ways that are only detectable if you go back and look carefully at actual frames from the show. The color scheme of the sign is one of the areas where memory most consistently departs from record. People tend to reach for warmer colors in their description of the sign, drawing on the mental category of convenience store signage rather than on the specific colors of this particular sign. The actual sign has a color profile that is different from what most people describe, but similar enough to what their description would predict that the discrepancy can seem minor until you put the two versions side by side. The font used for the Quickie Mart name on the sign is another source of consistent error. People remember it as bold, perhaps slightly stylized, clearly readable. These things are true in a general sense, but the specific character of the font, its exact weight, the specific shapes of its letter forms, has been rendered inconsistently across different episodes as different animation teams drew the sign, and memory has averaged these inconsistencies into a single composite font that doesn't quite match any specific drawing of the sign. This is one of the general features of Simpsons' visual memory. Background elements that appear consistently across many episodes, but that were drawn by many different hands over many years exist in memory in composite form. The memory version is an average, a platonic ideal of the thing that was never quite achieved on any individual occasion. The interior of the Quickie Mart generates its own memory distortions, and these are in some ways more interesting because they involve spatial memory rather than just visual detail. The store's interior across different episodes is not architecturally consistent. This is a feature of animation that viewers who have studied the show closely are familiar with. The interior spaces of recurring locations change size and layout depending on what the scene requires. The Quickie Mart sometimes appears to contain a significant amount of floor space with multiple distinct sections. Sometimes it appears barely large enough to hold two people and a counter. The counter itself shifts in its placement relative to the door and the shelves. Memory of the store's interior is a composite of all these versions, and what the composite most closely resembles is a general concept of the interior that feels right rather than a specific floor plan. If you tried to draw the Quickie Mart from memory, the drawing would be recognizable as the right kind of place. Small convenience store, counter in roughly the right area, shelves in roughly the right area, but the specific spatial relationships wouldn't match any individual scene from the show. This is spatial memory doing what spatial memory does with familiar but unexamined spaces. You know the space well enough to navigate it in your imagination, but not well enough to describe it architecturally. You have the feel of it, the texture of it. The space is real to you without being accurate. The squishy machine, which is one of the Quickie Mart's most iconic props, is misremembered in its placement within the store by a meaningful number of viewers. People who feel confident about the layout place the squishy machine in slightly different locations than its typical position in the show. Some put it near the entrance, some put it toward the back, some put it directly adjacent to the counter. The machine is real in everyone's memory. The specific wall it lives against is not. The lighting of the Quickie Mart is worth mentioning because it contributes to a specific kind of atmospheric memory that the show cultivated deliberately. Convenience stores are associated with a particular quality of fluorescent lighting. Bright, slightly cold, slightly blue-white, the kind of lighting that makes everything look like it's being assessed rather than appreciated. The Quickie Mart's interior is lit in this way in many episodes, and that lighting quality has been stored as one of the defining characteristics of the space in memory. But in other episodes, particularly later in the show's run, the interior lighting has a warmer character. The store looks slightly less clinical, slightly more like a real neighborhood shop where people actually want to spend a few minutes. This warmer version exists in memory for some viewers and not others. And which version dominates in a given person's memory often corresponds to which period of the show they watched most intensively. The Quickie Mart is, in the end, exactly what it needed to be. A functional background space that became a beloved backdrop for 36 years of storytelling. Remembered imprecisely but warmly by everyone who spent time there, exactly as real neighborhood shops are remembered imprecisely but warmly by the people who used to stop in regularly on the way home. There is one more angle on the Quickie Mart and memory worth exploring, and it is the one that touches on how we remember places that we associate with a particular person versus places we experience in their own right. For most viewers, the Quickie Mart is Apu's store. Not just a store that Apu happens to work in, but a space that is fundamentally constituted by his presence. When you picture the Quickie Mart, you almost certainly picture Apu behind the counter, and the visual of the store is assembled around that central presence. The counter, the shelving, the squishy machine, all of it is arranged in memory as backdrop to Apu, and Apu is what the memory was actually storing. This means that changes in how viewers relate to Apu and his character have had a measurable effect on how the Quickie Mart is remembered. The conversations that have taken place over the last decade about the portrayal of Apu and what it means, those conversations are now part of the associative network around the store. People approach the memory differently because they approach the character differently. The store, as a visual memory object, is inseparable from the feelings and associations that have accumulated around the person it belongs to. This is a good reminder that memories of fiction are not stored in a sealed container, protected from everything that happened after the original viewing. They are stored in the same network as everything else you know and feel and believe. The Simpsons you remember is The Simpsons filtered through everything you've thought about it since you first watched it, including things you've thought very recently. The quick e-mart that exists in your memory right now is a quick e-mart that has been visited by every version of you that has thought about it since you first walked through its glass door. It has been shaped by every conversation, every online discussion, every time someone asked you about the show or you found yourself thinking about it. It is a palimpsest, a surface written over again and again, earlier versions showing through faintly beneath the most recent inscription. And the most recent inscription, the most current version of the memory, is not necessarily the most accurate one. Sometimes the earliest version, the one laid down when the viewing was fresh and the associations were simple, was closer to the record. And sometimes the most recent version, incorporating 30 years of additional context and understanding, is actually truer to what the show meant, even if it's less precise about what the show showed. The Quickie Mart is somewhere between these. Exactly the shade of memory it needs to be. The squishy machine is always in the right corner. The hot dogs are always on the heater, eternal and unanswerable. The counter is always there with someone patient on the other side of it. That's the store, you know. That's the one that counts. Section 8, Bart's Catchphrases. The lines you think you know. Bart Simpson was introduced to the world as a walking, talking collection of catchphrases. Before anyone had seen a full episode, before the show had developed its characters beyond initial sketches, before the specific comedy of the show's best seasons had fully emerged, Bart existed in the cultural conversation, primarily as a source of quotable lines. The catchphrases appeared on merchandise before most people had seen more than a few minutes of animation. They existed on t-shirts and bumper stickers and school notebooks as free-floating declarations, independent of any narrative context. This was by design. The early promotional strategy for The Simpsons was heavily catchphrase forward, and it worked. The phrases became attached to the character so thoroughly and so quickly that they were already deeply embedded in the culture before the show had time to develop Bart into something more complex and interesting than his promotional version suggested. And this early, heavy promotional saturation is the source of the most interesting and most psychologically revealing Mandela effects in the Bart catchphrase space. Because what it created was a situation where many viewers formed their primary memory of Bart's speech patterns, not from the show, but from the culture around the show. And the culture around the show preserved the promotional version of Bart rather than the evolved version. Consider Eat My Shorts. This is Bart's. Unambiguously, completely Bart's. It is the phrase most immediately associated with the character in the public consciousness, particularly for people who were in a specific age range during the show's early years when it was ubiquitous on merchandise and in the general cultural conversation. It communicates the character's sensibility efficiently. Slightly defiant, casually transgressive, the voice of a kid who has considered the available social conventions and decided not to invest heavily in any of them. Most people who love The Simpsons remember this phrase being used frequently throughout the show's run. They remember Bart saying it regularly across multiple seasons as a recurring feature of his speech. They have memories of specific episodes where the phrase appeared, specific contexts where it was deployed. The phrase appears most heavily in the show's early seasons and in its promotional period. As the show developed and the writers gained confidence in Bart as a complex character, the catchphrase became less prominent. A fully developed Bart, a Bart with genuine emotional depth and interesting relationships and a real inner life, didn't need to announce himself through a catchphrase every few scenes. The phrase exists in the show, it just doesn't appear with anything like the frequency that memory suggests. What happened is that the promotional Bart and the narrative Bart were received simultaneously but weighted differently by different viewers. Some people absorbed the narrative Bart most deeply, the one who gradually revealed himself across hundreds of episodes of real storytelling. Their memory of Bart is anchored in specific episodes, specific relationships, specific moments of genuine feeling. For them, the catchphrase is a memory from the early period of the show rather than a consistent feature of all of it. Other people, particularly those for whom the show was background rather than primary engagement, who watched it but didn't follow it closely, absorbed the promotional Bart more deeply because the promotional Bart was louder and simpler and easier to store. For them, the catchphrase might genuinely feel like something they heard constantly across all of Bart's appearances. Both groups are right about the show they watched. The show contained both Barts. The question is which one a given viewer absorbed most completely. Don't Have a Cow, Man generates its own specific set of memory variations, and they're the kind of variations that reveal how rhythm and cadence in dialogue is stored differently from meaning. The phrase itself, as a semantic unit, is stored accurately by almost everyone. The content, like the specific dismissal, the animal metaphor, the appended man that softens the dismissal into something almost friendly, is right in virtually every memory. But the specific rhythm, the exact emphasis pattern, the precise timing of the syllables as Bart delivers them, these are stored imprecisely and reproduced imprecisely. When people imitate Bart saying this phrase, they produce a range of slightly different performances. Some versions are faster, some slower. Some put the emphasis on cow, some spread it more evenly. Some run have a cow together as a unit. Some give cow room to breathe. None of these versions is definitively wrong because the show itself used the phrase in slightly different ways across different scenes. But most people, if asked, will insist their version is the right one, when in fact their version is the average of several performances, filtered through memory and shaped by however many times they've heard other people's imitations. This is one of the more subtle ways that catchphrase memory works. The semantic content is preserved accurately, but the specific performance, the way the words were actually said, is reconstructed from a combination of the original and all the imitations the person has heard since. The phrase in your memory sounds like Bart, but it might be several degrees removed from what the recording actually contains. Ay, caramba creates a different kind of variation. This one splits people on the specific vowel configuration, whether it's I or I in terms of the first syllable. And this seemingly minor orthographic question reflects a real perceptual variation in how people heard and stored the sound. The question of how to spell it influences how you internally represent the sound, and how you represent the sound influences how you remember having heard it. The cultural life of Bart's catchphrases outside of the show is as important to understand as their life inside it. These phrases have been imitated, parodied, referenced, and quoted by so many people over so many years that they now exist in a kind of cultural ambient noise that anyone who grew up in the English-speaking world between roughly 1990 and 2005 absorbed continuously. Every imitation you've heard modified the original slightly. Every friend who said, "Don't have a cow," while trying to sound like Bart, gave you a version that was their reconstruction, not the original, and that version entered your memory and mixed with what was already there. The Bart catchphrases that live in memory are genuine memories. They're also partly composites of 1,000 performances by people who loved the show and gave the phrases new life outside of it. The original and the imitations have been in dialogue for 3 decades, and neither has emerged unchanged. There is a dimension of the catchphrase memory question that touches on something specific to childhood absorption of culture, and it is worth spending a moment with it before we move on. When you first learned Bart's catchphrases, and most people who grew up with the show did learn them, in the way that you learn a song from the radio, not by studying it, but by absorbing it through repeated exposure. You learned them in a social context as much as in a viewing context. These were phrases that circulated at school, on playgrounds, in the hallways, and lunch tables, and backyards where the cultural vocabulary of childhood gets constructed and shared. You heard them from other children who had heard them from other children, each transmission adding tiny distortions and personalizations. By the time the phrase got from the television screen to your memory, it had already passed through multiple human interpretations. The version you carried may have been shaped as much by the way a classmate said it as by the way Bart Simpson said it. And the classmate was working from their own imperfect memory, shaped by their own set of transmissions and so on backward through an increasingly blurry chain of childhood reenactments. Language memory of this kind is particularly susceptible to drift because we don't store language the way a recording device stores sound. We store the meaning, the feeling, the social context, and a rough phonological sketch. Two words with similar sounds and similar meanings, used in similar emotional contexts, can blend in memory until the distinction between them is lost. Was it eat my shorts or kiss my shorts? Was it don't have a cow or don't be a cow? Was it ay caramba or hey caramba? The answers are knowable from the record, but the experience of uncertainty is real, and the uncertainty is a fair reflection of the imprecision with which these phrases were stored. Not because they weren't loved, but because the mode of loving them was social and performative rather than archival. You love these lines enough to say them out loud, which is actually a different thing from loving them enough to memorize them. Saying them out loud was the point. Getting them exactly right was secondary to having them ready, to participating in the shared vocabulary, to belonging to the group of people who spoke this language. The variations in how people remember Bart's catchphrases are, in this reading, a record of all the different ways those phrases were used and loved and personalized across 30 years of social life. Each version is somebody's authentic recollection. Each version is a trace of a real moment when someone was 10 years old and said something on a playground and felt briefly like they had access to something cool. That's worth more than perfect accuracy. Section 9. Sideshow Bob. The tattoo that may never have existed. Robert Underdunk Terwilliger Jr., known to Springfield and to the watching world as Sideshow Bob, is the show's greatest recurring antagonist, held together by a collection of very specific visual details that function as identity markers in memory almost as strongly as the characters' faces themselves. The hair, the shoes, the vast flat feet that have been deployed as plot devices across multiple celebrated episodes. The voice, which is one of the most distinctive voice performances in the history of American animation. A voice that could plausibly have belonged to a Shakespearean actor before it became the voice of a criminal clown. And the tattoos. Bob's hands, specifically the knuckles, carry a tattoo that is one of the most memorable and most discussed props in the entire show. On one hand, the word Bart. On the other, the word die. The full message, Die Bart, encodes everything relevant about Bob's relationship to his primary obsession in 4 letters distributed across 8 knuckles. It's elegant in its economy. It communicates the character's fixation efficiently and permanently. This is confirmed. This is canonical. This exists across multiple Bob appearances and is referenced by other characters on at least one occasion. But there is another tattoo, one that a meaningful and consistent group of viewers remember seeing somewhere on Bob's body, his neck most commonly, or his forearm in some accounts. That is not the knuckle tattoo, and that does not appear when people go looking for it in the episodes. The descriptions of this other tattoo vary. Some people describe it as a symbol or image of some kind, something that looks like it might be meaningful in the way that prison tattoos are meaningful, that carries a reference to something in the character's history. Some people describe it as including text, though they can't specify what text. Some people simply describe it as a marking, a clearly intentional tattoo in a location that they're certain of, without being able to describe the specific content. The fact that the descriptions vary is itself informative. When people have genuinely seen something and remember it, even imprecisely, there's usually a core of consistent content in the descriptions. The same location, approximately the same kind of image. What varies is the detail, When the descriptions don't share a consistent core, it often suggests that the thing being described wasn't seen so much as inferred. Bob's character history includes prison time. Bob is a violent criminal who has repeatedly attempted murder and has been incarcerated multiple times. Bob has knuckle tattoos that announce his intentions regarding a specific 10-year-old child. Bob is, in almost every respect, exactly the kind of person who would have additional tattoos beyond the ones on his hands. Memory, given this character profile and given the confirmed existence of the knuckle tattoos, extrapolated. It built a more thoroughly tattooed Bob. It said, of course this man has more tattoos than the ones on his knuckles, and then it stored the conclusion as a memory of having seen the evidence for it on screen. This is a form of memory construction that cognitive scientists call confabulation. Not lying, not misremembering in a simple way, but filling in gaps with plausible content and then failing to distinguish the filled-in content from actually observed content. The brain builds a model of a person from available evidence, fills in what the model predicts, and stores the predicted content with the same confidence as the observed content, because from inside the process they feel identical. Bob should have more tattoos. Therefore, Bob has more tattoos. Therefore, I remember seeing them. There are other Bob-specific memory distortions worth noting. His hair in memory tends toward the more extreme end of what the show actually depicted. The hair is already enormous, one of the most distinctive silhouettes in animated television. In memory, it gets bigger still. The most dramatic version of the hair becomes the canonical version, because the most dramatic version is the one that anchored the identity most thoroughly. His performances also exist in memory in a slightly more heightened form than the recording support. Kelsey Grammer's actual delivery of Bob's most theatrical speeches is, by any measure, already extremely theatrical, but memory has amplified it slightly. The pauses are longer in memory, the vowels more elongated. This is what happens when you love a performance. Memory treats it the way a highlight reel treats a career. The best moments become the representative version. The scenes where Bob was simply present and functional rather than magnificently terrible got absorbed into the scenes where he was magnificent, and the composite is more magnificent than the average, but also more magnificent than most individual scenes. Bob is more dangerous in memory than in the show. His hair is larger, his voice is more theatrical, his tattoos are more extensive. He is the Bob that the show was reaching toward, assembled from all the moments when it got there and the many more when it was close. The sideshow. Bob Case is interesting to dwell on a moment longer because it illustrates a dynamic that appears across many of the characters we've discussed, but is most visible here. The gap between what a character was in the first season and what they became by the fifth. When Sideshow Bob first appeared, he was a supporting character in a children's show. His initial role was to frame Krusty the Clown and take over the show. The ambition of the character in those early episodes was modest. He was a background comic presence, a punchline waiting to be set up. The grandeur that would define him in later seasons was not yet there. The Bob of memory for most people is the Bob of his middle period, Season 5 through roughly Season 10, when the writers had fully committed to the character's operatic potential and were giving him episodes that matched his scope. This is the Bob who attempted to kill Bart at every available opportunity while delivering increasingly elaborate speeches about the failure of the modern world to reward genuine cultivation and intelligence. This is the Bob who stepped on rakes. This is the magnificent, ridiculous, genuinely touching Bob who loved civilization and was prevented from enjoying it by his own obsessions. The early Bob, the simpler Bob, tends to get absorbed into this later image. And the tattoo question is, at its root, a question about which version of Bob your memory went to when it constructed its archive of the character. The later Bob, The elaborate, self-dramatizing, revenge-obsessed Bob is precisely the kind of person who would have "Bart Simpson must die" tattooed somewhere visible. It is completely consistent with his character as he developed. The early Bob, the slightly more mundane criminal, probably would not have done it. He was not yet the kind of person who turned his grievances into aesthetics. Your memory may have constructed the tattoo from the character, not from the footage. You assembled the Bob you knew and reasoned forward to what that Bob would have done to his own body. And the answer your imagination arrived at, yes, he would have that tattoo, of course he would, felt so right, so consistent with everything you understood about the character, that it lodged as a memory rather than a prediction. This is perhaps the kindest possible version of how a false memory forms. Not as a failure of perception, not as confusion or carelessness, but as a very accurate piece of character analysis arriving slightly ahead of the evidence. You understood Sideshow Bob well enough to know what he would have done. You were right about the character. The show just didn't quite go there. Section 10. The Simpsons theme. Notes you are hearing wrong. Bring the Simpsons theme into your head right now. Not an effort. Just let it come the way it always does. Unbidden and complete. The way music associated with beloved things tends to arrive when you so much as think about them. What you're hearing is not quite right. This is one of the most surprising things to tell someone who loves the show, because audio memory tends to feel more reliable than visual memory. We believe we know what things sound like with a confidence we don't always feel about colors or specific details. Music especially. Music feels precise in memory, held as rhythm and melody together, stored with the kind of completeness that a color value or a sprinkle count doesn't seem to achieve. But the Simpsons theme, composed by Danny Elfman and first heard by audiences in December 1989, is a more rhythmically complex piece of music than most people's internal reproduction of it accurately reflects. The melody is correct in memory in a general sense. If you hear the theme after a long time away from it, you recognize it immediately. The notes are in the right order, the key is right, the character is right, the overall shape of the phrase is right. The memory of the theme and the recording of the theme correspond closely enough that recognition is immediate and complete. But in the specific rhythmic values of individual notes, in the precise timing of accents and syncopations, in the particular bounce and lurch of the phrase as Elfman actually composed it, these elements are simplified and smoothed in memory in ways that are detectable when you listen carefully to the original after a period of relying on your internal version. The opening figure of the theme, the short descending line that launches the whole piece, has a specific rhythmic character that involves a small but meaningful irregularity. The timing between certain notes is not perfectly even. The phrase has a slight forward lean, a rhythmic propulsion, that is part of what makes it feel like the beginning of something alive, rather than the beginning of something mechanical. This irregularity is one of the elements that most consistently gets smoothed out in memory. The mental reproduction tends to even up the spacing, regularize the rhythm, make the phrase slightly more metronomic than it actually is. The result is a theme that sounds correct and complete in memory, that functions perfectly as a recognition signal, and produces all the appropriate associated feelings. But that is measurably different from the actual recording in specific rhythmic respects. The theme has also been recorded in multiple versions over the course of the show's run. The version that aired in early seasons was slightly different from the version produced after the show moved to HD, which was slightly different from various special recordings made for particular events or seasons. The tempo, the orchestration, and specific details of the arrangement have varied across these versions. Viewers who watch the show across its full run have heard several different versions of the theme and stored them together under a single label. What they remember is the composite, the theme that is an average of all the versions. which doesn't precisely match any specific recording. This is normal for long running shows, but it means that the theme you remember is genuinely yours, assembled from your specific viewing history, rather than being a straightforward copy of any particular recording. The famous vocal sound, a kind of wordless syllable that appears at a specific moment in the theme, is another area of variation in memory. People are split on the precise quality of that sound, some remembering it as more nasal, some as fuller and more choral. The actual recording sits somewhere that different memories have interpreted differently depending on the speaker and the playback device and the acoustic environment in which the theme was most often heard. And there is the connection between the theme and the couch gag to consider, because the two are so thoroughly linked in experience that they've become linked in memory. The theme is the music that plays while the couch gag unfolds, and the two have been stored together so many times that they've begun to influence each other in memory. People sometimes misremember the length of the theme based on their memory of a particularly long or short couch gag. People sometimes misremember the energy or tempo of the theme based on the tone of the couch gag sequence it accompanied in a specific memorable episode. The theme in your memory is the Simpsons theme. It is exactly right in every way that matters. You would recognize it anywhere, under any conditions, at any volume. It would reach into whatever state of attention or inattention you were in and pull you into Springfield. The specific rhythm of the opening figure is a little smoother than it should be. The length is an average of several versions. The specific quality of the famous vocal sound is your calibration rather than the recording's exact specification. These are small differences. They don't change anything important about the theme or your relationship to it. The theme still does what it was built to do. It opens a door that leads back to something you love. The precise architecture of the door is slightly reconstructed rather than remembered. There is something worth saying specifically about the kind of expertise we develop around pieces of music we love deeply, and what that expertise does to our memories of those pieces. When you love a piece of music enough to have heard it hundreds of times, you develop what researchers call implicit musical knowledge, a deeply internalized sense of how the music works, where it goes, what comes next, what the relationships between its elements are. This knowledge lives below conscious awareness. You don't think about the Simpsons theme when it plays, you simply receive it, and your implicit knowledge guides your experience of it, telling you when to expect the melody to turn, when the rhythm will shift, when the famous vocal moment arrives. This implicit knowledge is extraordinarily accurate about the music's large-scale structure. It knows the macro, the full arc, the beginning, middle, and end. It knows where the energy peaks. It knows the general contour of every phrase, but it is less reliable about the micro, the specific rhythmic value of the third note in the fifth bar, the precise interval of the transition into the saxophone segment. These micro-level details were never required for the implicit knowledge to function perfectly, so they were stored with less precision. And when memory is asked to report on those micro-level details, when someone challenges you to sing it and you try to be accurate, the implicit knowledge fills in the gaps with what feels right according to the structural model. What feels right is usually very close, but close is not the same as exact. And the places where close diverges from exact are precisely the places where people disagree about what the theme actually does. There is also a meaningful phenomenon around the harmony that underlies the melody. Most people, when asked to reproduce the Simpsons theme, reproduce the melody with reasonable accuracy. The harmony, the underlying chord structure, the specific notes that give the melody its character and color, is much less reliably reproduced. People who have musical training and have consciously analyzed the harmony may have a more precise memory of it. But for most listeners, the melody is remembered, and the harmony is felt but not stored precisely. This means that if the harmony were changed, if a different set of underlying chords were substituted for the original, many listeners would notice something was off without being able to say exactly what. And this also means that when people remember the theme and try to sing it or hum it, they often add slightly different harmonic implications to the melody because they're filling in the harmony from a felt sense rather than from stored data. The theme you carry in your head has a slightly different harmony than the one on the recording. Not wrong exactly, just yours, filtered through your musical intuitions and your emotional history with the show. The version your mind plays has been lovingly personalized, and it sounds to you exactly right. Section 11. Springfield's location. Your memory has a map that doesn't exist. This Mandela effect is different from all the others, and the difference is worth naming carefully before we move into it. Every other Mandela effect we've examined tonight has involved misremembering something specific about the show's actual visual or audio content. The wrong shade of yellow, the couch's upholstery color, the exact number of sprinkles, the rhythm of a phrase. These are cases where the show put a specific thing on screen and memory stored an approximation of it. This one is different because it involves a confident memory of something the show never quite put on screen at all. A surprising number of people who love The Simpsons have, somewhere in their internal model of the show, a settled sense of where Springfield is located. Not just a feeling, a specific answer, a state, or at minimum, a strong regional association. And they remember acquiring this information from the show. They remember a scene, or a reference, or a moment of disclosure in which the show's geographical situation became clear. They remember having the question answered. The question was never answered. Or rather, it was answered so many times, in so many contradictory ways across so many episodes and seasons, that the answers cancel each other out rather than adding up to a fact. Springfield has been placed in the north and in the south, near an ocean and far from any coast, bordering Ohio and bordering Nevada and bordering Maine. Its climate has ranged from blizzard conditions to tropical heat waves, sometimes within the span of a single season of the show's run. Its terrain has included mountains and deserts and farmland and forest, all within driving distance of each other. Its state abbreviation has been shown as NT, which is not a real state. Characters have referred to its geographic position in ways that contradict previous references without acknowledgement. This is not inconsistency in the sense of the writers making mistakes. The writers were not making mistakes. The contradictions are intentional. The show made a specific creative decision, present essentially from its beginning, to keep Springfield unlocatable. The reasoning is clear from any interview with the show's creators. A Springfield that could be anywhere is a Springfield that belongs to everyone. The viewer from Ohio, and the viewer from Oregon, and the viewer from Texas, and the viewer from Massachusetts should all feel that Springfield is their town. And the only way to achieve that is to make Springfield impossible to pin down. The show succeeded at this completely. Springfield is everyone's town. Everyone who has watched the show has felt at home there, felt the recognition that comes from seeing your own community's specific absurdities reflected in the show's comic mirror. But the human mind resists unlocatability. It needs things placed. When you spend hundreds of hours in a fictional location, the mind builds a geography for that location and needs to anchor it somewhere in relation to the real world. It reaches for the available evidence and uses whatever piece of it is most available and most convincing to locate the town. Different viewers anchored to different pieces of evidence. Some people anchored to Matt Groening's 2012 interview with the Smithsonian Magazine, in which he acknowledged that he named Springfield after Springfield, Oregon, where he grew up. This was real. Groening said it. It entered the cultural record as an official disclosure. Oregon, Springfield, problem solved, the question is answered. Except the show immediately continued contradicting this. Episodes after the interview placed Springfield in geographic contexts clearly inconsistent with Oregon. The writers didn't consider Groening's interview binding on their creative decisions, and they went right on making Springfield impossible to locate. Oregon lasted as the official answer for approximately 48 hours. Some people anchored to the Missouri area code that appears in at least one episode when a character's phone number is visible. Missouri Springfield, that's consistent with the Midwest. That feels like the right kind of American geography for this kind of town, filed and stored. Some people anchored to a specific episode in which a character makes a reference to a neighboring state, and that reference felt definitive and became the settled answer for everything that followed. And some people anchored to a composite, not a specific piece of evidence, but a general impression of the show's aesthetic, the way the town looks and feels, which corresponds to a specific part of their own geography, the place they grew up or the place they know best, and that correspondence felt like recognition rather than association. Here is the most interesting version of this particular Mandela effect. Some viewers remember a specific scene. They can often describe it in some detail, in which Springfield's location was clearly and directly stated, not hinted at, not implied, said outright by a character in a scene that they remember as a moment of deliberate disclosure. They remember the feeling of the mystery being resolved. They remember thinking, so that's where it is. When these people describe the scene, the descriptions vary too much to correspond to a single real episode. Some place it in one season, some in another. Some describe dialogue that doesn't appear in any episode transcript. Some describe visual elements, a map on a wall, a sign in the background, that would be present in one version of the scene but not another. What they're describing is a composite memory assembled from the feeling of having wanted the question answered, plus whatever real episode material was available to support that feeling, plus the emotional satisfaction of resolution. The brain, encountering the question of Springfield's location through years of engagement with the show and the culture around it, eventually produced an answer. It assembled an answer from available materials, a comment Groening made, a phone number on screen, a reference in an episode, the general impression of the show's geography, and stored the assembly as a memory of having received the answer from the show directly. The memory feels real because the feeling of resolution is real. The brain genuinely resolved the question. It just resolved it internally rather than receiving a resolution from the screen, and then misattributed the internal resolution to an external source. Springfield is wherever you need it to be. It's your town with its specific impossible geography. The mountains and the ocean and the desert, all available for the appropriate episode, the climate varying to serve the story. Your memory placed it somewhere, and that placement felt like the show telling you, and the show never told you. But your Springfield is still real in every way that matters. The geographic memory confusion around Springfield connects to something larger about how we map fictional worlds in our minds, and it is worth spending a few more moments with before we move into the final section. Real places and fictional places are stored differently in the memory. When you remember a real place, a city you visited, a neighborhood you grew up in, there is a kind of proprioceptive memory alongside the visual one. You remember the physical experience of being there, the particular way your body felt moving through the space, the specific sensations of temperature and sound and smell that accompanied the visual information. Real places are remembered in 3 dimensions and across multiple senses. Fictional places are usually remembered in 2 dimensions. They are the dimensions available through a screen, visual and auditory, but not physical. This means the memory of a fictional place tends to be less anchored than the memory of a real place. There is less raw sensory data to build from, and so more of the construction work is done by imagination and inference. And because imagination and inference are doing more of the work, they are more likely to import material from real experiences that seem analogous. If Springfield feels like it might be in the Midwest, your memory might borrow some of its geography from real Midwestern places you've been to or seen. If it feels coastal, it might borrow from coastal memories. The fictional geography gets populated with borrowed sensory detail, and the borrowed detail carries its own spatial logic. This is why people's memories of Springfield's location tend to correspond loosely to their own geographic experience. Someone who grew up in the Pacific Northwest is somewhat more likely to place Springfield there. Someone from the Midwest tends to find the heartland reading more intuitive. The show's deliberately ambiguous geography creates a space for each viewer to place it somewhere familiar, and familiar places get populated with familiar memories. The Springfield you know is built partly from wherever you've actually been. Its streets have some of the feeling of your streets. Its seasons have some of the quality of the seasons you've lived through. Its light has some of the character of the light you know. This is why it feels so immediate, so present, so real, because it is partly real. It contains pieces of everywhere you've been, and the memory of its location, whatever state you placed it in, is a record of which real place Springfield borrowed from most heavily in your experience. It is the address of the real geography that your mind recruited to fill in the fictional gaps. There is one more element of the Springfield geography memory worth considering, and it brings us full circle to the show's most fundamental design choice. The show was created to be universal. Not universal in the vague sense of appealing to everyone, but universal in the specific sense of being placeable everywhere. The geographic impossibility was the point. The contradictions were not carelessness. They were the mechanism by which the show could be everyone's show. And memory, encountering this universal design, did exactly what it was designed to do. Every viewer took the geographic flexibility and used it to install Springfield somewhere specific and personal. The show gave you the space, and your life gave you the material, and together you built a place that felt like yours. That is not a memory error. That is the show working exactly as intended, and memory doing exactly what it was recruited to do. The confusion arises only when you try to compare notes. When you discover that your Springfield is in Oregon, and someone else's is in Kentucky, and a third person's is inexplicably in New Jersey. The differences are real, and they can feel like evidence of a mistake somewhere. But the differences are the design. The differences are what happens when a show about everywhere is received by people from everywhere. Springfield is in all of those states and none of them. It is the American town that could be any American town, assembled from the memories of everyone who watched it and installed wherever each person needed it to be. The map your memory drew is not wrong. It is yours. Section 12. Why Our Brains Changed Springfield. The grand finale. We have been in Springfield for a long time now. Longer than any single episode. Longer than most arcs. We've sat with the yellow that isn't quite the yellow memory describes. We've looked at the blue couch that so many people remember as orange. We've counted the sprinkles that are fewer than they should be. We've heard the theme in its smoothed, memory-averaged version rather than the specific recording that Elfman made. We've navigated by a map that the show never drew. And now, in the quiet of wherever you are, in whatever hour of the night or early morning finds you here, it seems worth slowing down even further and thinking about what all of these Mandela effects are actually telling us. Because they're telling us something true and interesting and worth sitting with as you drift toward sleep. Memory is not a recording. It never was. It was never designed to be one. It was never capable of being one. And treating it as a recording device that makes errors misses the entire point of what memory is and why it exists. Memory is a system for extracting meaning from experience and making that meaning available for future use. It stores what things are for and what they mean and how they made you feel and what happened as a result. It stores the important stuff, the precise visual details, the exact color values, the specific number of sprinkles. These are not the important stuff, and the system doesn't allocate resources to them the way a recording device would. The couch is furniture. What the couch means is the family gathered together, the episode resolved, the structure of the household reaffirmed. The specific wavelength of light reflecting off the couch's upholstery is not part of what the couch means, and so it wasn't stored with precision. When the memory is later accessed and the couch is reconstructed, it gets reconstructed from the meaning warm, domestic, the family's place, the center of the household. And warm domestic, the family's place, produces orange more readily than it produces blue. The reconstruction is faithful to the meaning, even when it's unfaithful to the record. And faithfulness to meaning, in most contexts, is more important than faithfulness to record. The couch in your memory serves its purpose. You know where it is in the living room. You know who sits on it and in what general arrangement. You know it's the place where things get resolved. The specific blue is the only thing wrong, and the specific blue was never the point. What the collective Simpsons Mandela effects reveal, taken together, is the depth to which the show was absorbed. Not watched, absorbed. The details that are misremembered are details that were never actively examined, never consciously attended to, never explicitly valued as facts worth storing. They were the wallpaper, the background, the color temperature of a room you spent a lot of time in without ever studying the paint, and the details that are remembered correctly, the ones that survive intact across decades of imperfect storage, are the ones that carried meaning, the characters and what they meant to each other, the dynamics of the family and the neighborhood, the particular quality of each character's voice as an expression of who they were. The general visual vocabulary of the show. Yellow skin, couch, power plant, quickie mart, as a system of recognition that said, this show, this town, these people, I know these people. That system of recognition is perfect. It has always been perfect. You can look away from The Simpsons for 20 years and then see 2 seconds of the show on someone else's screen across the room and know immediately what you're looking at. The recognition is instantaneous and complete. Whatever memory did with the precise details, it kept the recognition perfectly intact. And there's something in this that applies beyond the specific case of a beloved television show. The way we remember The Simpsons is the way we remember everything. The people we loved are remembered more accurately in terms of what they meant than in terms of what they looked like on any specific day. The places we grew up are remembered in terms of how they felt, rather than what precise color the kitchen walls were. The songs we loved are remembered in terms of their emotional impact more precisely than in terms of their specific note values. The experiences that shaped us are stored in their meaning, rather than in their documentary detail. This is not a flaw in human cognition, it is the central feature of it. A species that stored everything with photographic precision would be paralyzed by the volume and complexity of what would need to be stored. The capacity to abstract, to extract meaning and discard the record, to build models from experience and navigate by those models rather than constantly retrieving raw footage. This is what made us capable of learning, of understanding, of connecting with each other across time and distance and difference. The Simpsons Mandela effects are small, specific, harmless demonstrations of the same cognitive machinery that allows you to recognize a friend's voice on the phone without seeing their face. The machinery that lets you navigate a room you grew up in at midnight without turning on the light. The machinery that allows a story to mean something to you even after you've forgotten most of its details. Memory kept what mattered. Memory always keeps what matters. What mattered about The Simpsons, the reason people have watched it for 36 years and will presumably continue watching it, the reason these Mandela effects exist in the first place, is not the precise shade of anyone's skin or the exact number of sprinkles on a donut. What mattered is that there was a family, a specific, fully realized, specific to itself family, with all the complexity and absurdity and genuine love that families contain. A family that fought and forgave and got things wrong and tried again and sat down together at the end of every episode, regardless of what had happened. A family that existed in a town that was simultaneously every American town and no American town, speaking to something real about the experience of living in the specific kind of place America produces. What mattered is that the show got something true about what it's like to be a person, to want things you can't have, to love people who frustrate you, to live inside the gap between the life you imagined and the life that actually happened, and to find the gap livable, even funny, even beautiful in its specific imperfect shape. Memory kept all of that. Memory kept every bit of it. The yellow is slightly wrong, and the couch is wrong, and the sprinkles are wrong, and the rhythm of the theme is smoothed, and Springfield is located nowhere that matches the map in your head. But Homer is right. Marge is right. Bart and Lisa and Maggie are all exactly right. The family is intact. The house is on Evergreen Terrace. The town is Springfield, which is everywhere and nowhere, which is your town, which is everyone's town. The characters you loved are exactly who you needed them to be. The moments that stayed with you because they were worth keeping. The show got into you deeply enough that your brain decided the precise details were secondary to the thing itself. You misremembered the details. You remembered the show. Those are two very different things, and the second one is the only one that was ever worth keeping. Homer is still in that chair somewhere in the archive. Marge is still patient. Bart is still a child who can't be held still. Lisa is still asking a question nobody wants to answer. Maggie is still watching everything with those enormous eyes saying nothing, understanding more than anyone suspects. They are preserved exactly as they were. The record has them, every frame, every note, every syllable. And they are also preserved in a different way, less precise and more personal, in the vast collective memory of everyone who watched. That memory Springfield is slightly wrong in its details and completely right in its feeling. It is the Springfield that was received rather than the Springfield that was made, and in some ways that makes it more real, not less, because it is the Springfield that actually happened to people. It happened to you. The couch is waiting. The family is on it. The credits haven't rolled yet. Let me say one more thing before we let the quiet fully take over. One more thing about memory and love, and the specific shape that the two take when they meet a piece of culture that meant something real. There is a tendency, when we discover that our memories of something are imprecise, to feel a small private embarrassment about it, to feel that we should have been paying closer attention, to feel that our misremembering is a kind of failure of loyalty, that if we truly loved the show, we would have stored it correctly. We would know the exact color of the couch. We would have the theme note perfect. We would be able to settle with authority every question about what Bart actually said and what Burns actually did. But this is exactly backwards. The imprecision is not a sign that you weren't paying attention. It's a sign that you were paying the right kind of attention. The kind of attention that goes to meaning rather than record. The kind that goes to feeling rather than fact. The kind of attention that a child pays to something that is making them feel safe and interested and part of something larger than their immediate situation. Children don't take notes on the things they love. They inhabit them. They live inside them for a while and carry pieces of them when they leave. The pieces they carry are the pieces that fit in the specific shape of what they needed at the time. And the shape changes as they get older, and the pieces shift to fit the new shape. And by the time you are an adult looking back at something you loved as a child, the thing you see is not a record. It is a relationship. It is the ongoing negotiation between who you were then and who you are now, mediated by a thing that was present for both of you. The Simpsons were present for a lot of people across a very long span of time. The people they were present for changed dramatically in the years between first watching and watching again now. Of course, the memories shifted. The memories were being stored by different people at different points in the journey. The 8-year-old who first saw Homer fall down a hill stored something. The 14-year-old who started to understand the satire stored something different from the same source material. The adult who rewatched an episode and felt something unexpected stored something different again. All of those memories are yours, and they don't perfectly agree because they were formed by people who didn't perfectly agree with each other. And all of those people were you at different distances from the screen. There is a famous idea in philosophy of mind that there is no single stable self, that what we call I is actually a more or less continuous narrative constructed in real time from a shifting collection of memories, habits, preferences, and responses. The self is a story told about a person, and the story has to be revised constantly to incorporate new chapters. Your memory of The Simpsons is part of that story. It has been revised with every revisit, every conversation, every meme, every moment of recognition when something happened in real life and someone said, The Simpsons predicted this. The Springfield you carry is not a static file. It is a living chapter in an ongoing story about who you are and what things have mattered to you, and how the specific absurdity and warmth of that show met something specific in you and stayed. The Mandela effects are the visible seams. They are the places where different chapters of the story don't quite match, where the you at 10 and the you at 30 stored slightly different versions of the same thing and neither version fully dominated the other. They are evidence not of failure but of continuity. You have been in relationship with this show for long enough that it has multiple strata in memory. That is a remarkable thing. That is not something that happens with things you weren't paying attention to. The couch color is wrong. The mustache is slightly the wrong size. The sprinkles are slightly too many or slightly too few. The theme has a note that shouldn't be there, or is missing one that should. Springfield is in the wrong state. Burns says excellent slightly more often than he does. And Homer is your Homer. And Marge is your Marge. And Bart's voice is exactly the right pitch at exactly the right speed. And Lisa's saxophone sounds exactly the way it should sound, and you don't need to hear it to know exactly what it sounds like. Because it lives in you, note perfect, feeling perfect, complete. The details your brain got wrong were the ones it didn't need. The things it got right were everything. You remembered the show. The show lives in you correctly in the ways that matter. All those hours in Springfield were received fully. The meaning came through, the feeling came through, the family came through. Whatever else memory did or didn't do with the specific details, it did that. Sleep well. Homer is still in that chair somewhere in the archive. Marge is still patient. Bart is still a child who can't be held still. Lisa is still asking a question nobody wants to answer. Maggie is still watching everything with those enormous eyes, saying nothing, understanding more than anyone suspects. They are preserved exactly as they were. The record has them. Every frame, every note, every syllable. And they are also preserved in a different way. Less precise and more personal, in the vast collective memory of everyone who watched. That memory Springfield is slightly wrong in its details and completely right in its feeling. It is the Springfield that was received rather than the Springfield that was made, and in some ways that makes it more real, not less, because it is the Springfield that actually happened to people. It happened to you. The couch is waiting. The family is on it. The credits haven't rolled yet. Good night.